So welcome to this short video. I'm going to explain to you a little bit more about your thesis project, because it's different from what other people are doing, and it's different from anything else you've done before. So if I send it to you beforehand, that will help us to have a more productive discussion when we're actually meeting face to face. So why do qualitative research? Well, why not? That would be my first question. Well, of course, in all types of research, we want to find out stuff, and in psychology, we want to find out stuff about humans, the most interesting creatures in the world, apart from crows. They're maybe slightly more interesting, but we can argue about that. So we want to find out stuff. Now, sometimes what you've been looking at before is testing this with hypotheses, with theories, but sometimes you can't do that. You can't find an answer to your question using a theory or testing a hypothesis. Sometimes what we're interested in is actually people's own experiences. Qualitative research makes use of the fact that humans can think, we can self-reflect, and we have language. So sometimes the best way to find out something about humans is actually ask them about that. What is it like in their own words? So some of the questions that I'm either looking at right now or we'll be looking at with you is, what is it like? What is it like when you're an athlete and you get injured? You can use rating scales, questionnaires, or even do experiments, but that doesn't tell you what is it like. What is it like for you? How do students' eating habits change during their time at university? What makes it more likely that they're sticking to a healthy diet, and what completely throws their diet overboard? What's it like interacting with other people when you got facial paralysis and people behave towards you in a different way? Now, is that different from when you break your ankle? It's very different. How do, if they do, religious scientists integrate both these aspects, religion and science, into their selfhood? Is it possible in our university to find religious scientists? Do they exist? What's it like? I've often wondered this myself. What's it like to be a mature student and to be amongst a class of 18-year-olds? What's that like? Or how do people's identities change after a major life event? And last but not least, how do students revise for exams? What goes on? I mean, what really goes on? You probably have ideas, but when we actually start looking at that, what do they actually do? And what do they say that they're doing? So in all of these questions, what you need is a qualitative methodology. Now, one thing that's really important to think about right now is a bit of philosophy of science, to understand how is qualitative psychology different from quantitative. And for that, it's important to understand the ontology, the epistemology, and the methodology. And in your thesis and throughout your project, you will have to draw on these concepts. You'll have to demonstrate that you understand where you stand on these sort of lines. So ontology refers to your worldview. What do you think that there is to know? What's out there? Is there, do you take a realist view, and do you think that there is a real reality, an objective reality out there? Or do you take a relativist view, and do you think that all there is people's opinions, and that there isn't an actual objective reality outside of people's opinions and people's constructed reality? Is it all relative, or is there one objective truth? Epistemology relates to your ontology. Epistemology refers to how can you know what is there to know. So if you are a realist, then, and you think there is an objective reality out there, how can you know that objective reality? Well, by looking at what's there. So in that sense, you are a positivist. It doesn't mean you're happy, but it just means you're looking at observable things, observable behavior, scores on a test, numbers, differences between conditions. You look at what's actually there. If you are a relativist and you think all that's out there is a matter of perspective, then your epistemology will be constructivist. So you will think that in order to find out this subjective reality, you need to ask people what they think. You need to look at how people construct this reality. So you can't know that by just looking what's there, but you need to ask people what they think is there. And that influences your ontology, and your epistemology influence your methodology. If you are a realist who wants to uncover the truth by looking at what's there, you are most likely to be a quantitative psychologist. So you'll be doing experiments and you want to test hypotheses. If you are, on the other hand, a relativist who thinks that the world is subjective and there are lots of different views and not one is necessarily correct, and you're looking at the world by asking people what they think is out there, you're most likely to be a qualitative psychologist. So you're not testing a theory, but you're looking at what do people say about their world, how do they interpret it, and what insights do I gain from that. So if you are a quantitative psychologist, you take a nomothetic approach, which means it's something we looked at in personality. It's where you try to generalize based on your sample. You try to say something about the world. Well, not the whole world, but you try to say something about a wider population. Whereas an idiographic approach in qualitative psychology, that's where you try to study one particular group really in depth. So have a think about all of these concepts. Try to read a bit about this and see where do you stand, and with your particular research question, where do you think this is going to fit. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of different qualitative methodologies and methods. There are usually variations of these eight ones. In the book you'll find these are described in their own chapter in a really clear way. They also all have example articles. So I would suggest, I'm going to talk you through these in a minute, but when you think, oh, this is sort of my thing, I like this way of looking at it, read some of the articles that are described in the chapter as recommended reading to get an idea for how you can actually do this study. So I'll just talk you through these just briefly so you get a flavor for what they are, and it helps you to read the chapters better. So, IPA, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. That sounds really great when somebody asks you what you're doing between subjects or within subjects. You say, no, I'm doing interpretative phenomenological analysis. It's a really good word. But IPA for short. So what IPA does, the big question is, what is it like? That's what this study is, or this methodology is really good for. Like, what is it like to experience depression? What is it like to be the President of the United States? Not that the two are related, I don't know, but it could be. But it's just something that came up in my head. What it aims to explore is people's personal experience. The idea is not to generalize, but it looks at these particular people, how did they experience a particular thing. Double hermeneutic means that both you as an interviewer, you're trying to interpret what your participant is saying, and at the same time your participant is trying to interpret their life. So both of you are involved in the interpretation process. So it's subjective, and that's how it's meant to be. Your sample it's called purposive, and that means you're only usually interviewing, usually one-to-one semi-structured interviews, you're interviewing those people who can actually give you an answer to that question. So that could be a really small sample. So in the case of the, what is it like to be the President of the United States? Well, you wouldn't get more than 2. Barack Obama would probably be interested in taking part. Trump maybe, if he's here in Aberdeen for his golf course, you might get 2, but you certainly wouldn't get a focus group out of it. So you would only ask those 2 people. So it's a really homogeneous sample. That's what you were trying to aim for, people who've all been through the same thing. So what you do is you do a thematic analysis, I'll come to that later on, of each case, and then you interview the next person and you do a thematic analysis of that case. So in the end, what you write up is a narrative account, a story of these 3 or more or fewer people that you've interviewed. So you're basically trying to put into psychological terms what they have experienced, and you write about the insights that you gained from that, and you also then link it to the literature. Now, grounded theory, that's not something for the faint-hearted. It requires quite a lot of thinking. All of them do, but this one probably in particular. What you're trying to do with grounded theory is, after you've done thematic analysis, looking for the common themes in your data, you then try to actually create a theory. So you try and see, how do all these codes link together to form themes, how do all the themes go together, and what are the properties of these themes. It's an inductive process, so you don't start with a theory, but you're creating a theory. It's got a positivist and a constructivist element. Positivist in the sense that it's using a really systematic approach to create theories, and constructivist in the sense that the reality that this approach is trying to uncover is people's own subjective reality. Now, your research question may change as you do your study. You may start with something, and then as you interview people, you actually find your question changes slightly. There's something that people really want to talk about, so you go with that, and that's fine. It's very important, in fact, not to stick with what you think should happen, but let your participants take that interview somewhere. So you might start, and this is the example in the book, how does chronic illness affect people's lives? But actually what people are telling you is how they changed their life and changed themselves to accommodate physical losses and to reunify their body and their cells. So the question slightly changes, it nuances. Now, what makes this theory, or it makes this methodology a theory rather than just a description, is that after you've identified your themes, you then ask what's called analytical questions about them, about codes and about themes. So you try to think about what are the properties of this theme. If, say, in this particular question, how does chronic illness affect people's lives? If coping is one of the things that come up, then one of the themes, then you have to say okay, what is coping? What are the properties of coping? How is coping different from other ways of dealing with chronic illness? What makes it more likely that people cope? What makes it less likely that people cope? Does coping change over time? So you really try and give a very good analytic description of that particular theme. So it's quite an involved process, this one. You can also do narrative research. It's something I'm very interested in, because the main, it's often used for looking into identity, and that is one of my interests. The idea is that, well, the aim of narrative research is to discover people and their worlds by looking at the stories that they tell about themselves and their worlds. People always tell stories about things that happen to them, and it's these stories that we tell about ourselves that make us who we are. You know, we can tell stories where the main character is a hero, or somebody where everything always goes wrong, like a comedy or a tragedy, and you can tell a lot about people when you actually listen to how they talk about themselves. So how does identity develop? That's a really important question that's often addressed in this way. How does a sports injury affect the identity of an athlete over time? Something I'm looking at the moment is how do early career lecturers develop their teaching identity? What sort of stories do they tell about themselves? And so far it's been very fascinating. What you usually do here is, it's called a life story interview. So you get people in, and it's quite a long interview usually. You need to set aside maybe an hour per participant, and you ask them, tell me about your life. Just tell me, who are you? You start from the beginning and tell me about your life. People love it. They absolutely love it. I mean, how often does it happen if somebody says, you got an hour to tell us about yourself? It's people's most favorite subject, so you'll have no problem getting participants for that. So what you then analyze is, how is this narrative actually structured? As I mentioned, you know, do they talk about themselves in terms of it being a tragedy, or is it a comedy? Do they make fun of themselves? Is it regressive, so you know things were bad and they get worse and worse and worse? Or is it a story of progression? Do they learn things from their mistakes or from events that happen, and does it get better over time, or does it remain stable? What are the main issues that they're facing, that they're bringing up in this story? What are the metaphors, the analogies that they're using? You know, life is like a journey, or higher education is like a landscape. People talk about things in terms of metaphors, so which ones can you discover there? What are the values and beliefs that they convey to you? You can also use this as action research. And action research refers to research that has a practical purpose. So in the case of me looking at early career lecturers, I could use a story of one person about their development, and I show that to another person. And maybe if one person has a really positive, progressive story to tell, somebody else has a really negative story, then by showing that positive story to the person with the negative story may help them see their own life in a different perspective, and it actually might help them. So you can use it in that way. Then there's conversation analysis, which is a fascinating thing if you're interested in that. What it aims to look at is, how is it possible that humans have a coherent conversation with one another? If you listen to two friends talking, just imagine there's an alien who doesn't know the current political climate, the current social, cultural climate. He wouldn't be able to follow that conversation at all. Two people can talk with each other and convey a lot by actually saying very little. How does that work? What do we do when we take turns in talking? taking turns means one person says something, the other one responds, and the other one responds, etc. Conversation analysis assumes that okay, talking, you're communicating, but it's also action. Talking is action, not necessarily just communication. We do stuff when we communicate. We apologize. We lie. We make a request. We deny. We decline a request. We greet each other. All these things are done in talking. When you do this kind of research, the kind of data that you're looking at is naturally occurring data. So you want to not ask people, but you want to look at real conversations between people, between friends, between strangers. It's quite hard to actually find data, but it's not impossible. You can either do what's called unmotivated inquiry. That's where you just listen to people talking and you note the things that are odd or interesting, and then you follow that up. Or you can already have an idea of what you're interested in, like how do people exchange a greeting? What do people do when they greet each other? And then you just collect lots of instances of that particular phenomenon. Something I found really interesting, because I walk to work through the Spittal in Old Aberdeen, and I was listening to students talking in front of me or behind me. Psychology starts here before I get here. And the other day, and this happens a lot actually, I heard one student approaching the other one and said, "Hey, how you doing?" "Fine, fine. God, I'm so tired today." And I thought, well, you just said that you were fine, and now you're telling the other person that you're actually not fine. So that happens a lot. People initially in the greeting, they say that they're feeling great. Yes, fine, alright. And that almost seems like a formality, and only then they start talking about how they really feel. So I thought that was quite odd. Why do we do that? Why do we do it that way? But that's just an interest. But you can also apply this to real, so important, practical things, like how you can improve the effectiveness of job center interviews, or the suicide prevention helpline. How do people talk there with people on the other end of the phone? How to make that communication better, how to help people to read between the lines of what the other person is saying. Just take a sip. Now we're talking about conversation analysis. You just need to take some water. So this is a very interesting approach, but it's probably a bit difficult to actually get data. You also have discourse analysis, which, while it sounds like it's similar to conversation analysis, it's not. It's got a much broader scope. It looks at not just what do people do turn by turn, but it looks at an entire passage. What is this person doing when they're telling me this? In the book you'll find there's an example of a woman who broke up with her girlfriend, and she's telling the interviewer about that, how that went. And even though during that passage she doesn't actually mention the word sorry, it comes across as an apology. So that relates to how you actually analyze this, how you do discourse analysis. You look at a passage of text and you think as a researcher, how does the text come across? What are the elements in this text that make it feel like this way? Why does this come across like an apology? What is said? What is not said? How is it said? So context is important. Being able to read between the lines and assess your participants' non-verbal reactions are really important. You'll find there's another type of discourse analysis, Foucauldian discourse analysis. That's different in the sense that it doesn't look at what people are actually saying in a real conversation to you, but it's what are the discourses available in society at the time. For instance, right now, and for a while, we've had the romantic love discourse. When you talk about romantic love in the Western world, we know what you mean, and there are certain concepts related to that. So when you talk to somebody else, we know what you mean. Whereas in, say 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, there were other types of discourses that were available to people. It's like the schemas, the scripts that are available to people of any given society. Two things, cooperative inquiry and focus groups. I've put them together because they both involve having more than one participant in the room at any one time. The difference is, with cooperative inquiry, you are part of the group as a researcher. In a focus group, you're not part of the group. So in cooperative inquiry, and I have a feeling this might be applicable to at least one of you, you have experienced the same thing as your participants have experienced. You're part of the same group, and the things that you're going to discover are potentially relevant and life enhancing for you and for them. So it's like an action research. The things that you find are directly relevant to help people either become more empowered or more self-aware, or can actually change a policy. In focus groups, you're not there to be taking part in the discussions. You're just there to drop the questions and then let the group get on with it. So it's quite good to get a group opinion, or also to study how people in a group actually form an opinion. When you have people on their own, they're usually very, very strong and really one-sided. In a group, you'll find those opinions might come out in a more subtle way. So they talk with you, they talk with each other and not with you. Then there's thematic analysis. Now, thematic analysis is different from the others in the sense that it's a method. It's not a methodology. So a methodology is like a package holiday. It tells you where to go, what time to go, with whom and where you'll stay. A method is just a tool. A method is like just booking a flight. So what I mean is that a methodology like IPA, grounded theory, narrative research, not only does it give you the tools for how to do it, it also gives you the philosophical framework. It gives you lots of rules for how to do it. Thematic analysis isn't like that. It's like a method. It is a method. It just tells you how you can do it, but whether you do that in a realist way or in a relativist way, that is up to you. Most of the methodologies that we looked at just now can be combined with thematic analysis. Most of them actually have a thematic analysis element to it. So with thematic analysis, if you use it in a just a basic descriptive way, is just a very systematic, rigorous method to code your data, so to put your data into into descriptive packages and to link codes together to form bigger themes. When you read the literature, you find it's used as either big Q or small q. Small q isn't really qualitative research proper. Small q is taking a deductive approach. You start with a theory, and then you may interview people for their opinions or experiences, but you use that theory to look at the data. So can I find particular elements of this theory in this data? Big Q, that's the real business. That's where you take an inductive approach, you let people talk about their experiences, and you code based on what they're saying. Anything could happen with thematic analysis the big Q way. Regardless of how you do this, there are 6 stages. That involves familiarization with your data. So you obviously listen to participants, you transcribe interviews if that's what you've done, and by doing that you become very familiar with what people have said. Then you start coding, where you give labels to the passages of text. You group codes together to form themes, and it's generating themes. It's not looking at themes that emerge. Themes don't emerge. I know in my article that I've just published, I actually used the word emerge, which I shouldn't have done, but it's published now. Data in qualitative research don't emerge. That suggests that they're there waiting to be discovered by you. But you as a researcher actively generate the themes. It's your thoughts, your interpretation that goes into them. So after you've generated the themes, you need to review them. So you go back to earlier work and say, actually, do these themes make sense to the earlier interviews? So you may want to go back and forth a few times. Then you define them, give them a name, and then you write up, including quotes from the interviews. So it's quite an involved, time-consuming process. So what makes good research? In quantitative research we've got falsifiability, reliability, validity. Those don't apply in qualitative research. We have a checklist, but it's not meant to be a rigorous set of criteria. It's more like a guidelines. So we do talk about validity, but in a slightly different way. Validity in qualitative research means has it been done thoroughly? Is it genuine? Is it authentic? Can I believe in the data? So there are several principles that you need to be aware of. I'm not going to go into them right now because they're really well explained in the book. So throughout your study, throughout your thesis, make sure that you're aware of these, and keep checking in with yourself to see if you're still doing it the way you should. So what to do next? I know you're starting a little bit earlier than other students, but that's just because you have to shift things in your mind before you can actually apply that to a project. So what I'd like you to do is to think about what do I want to know? What is the question that I really want to find an answer to? And then decide, or not decide, but read the literature about this subject if you can find information about that. What's already known so far, and that's because you do need to know, maybe your question has already been answered, maybe it's been answered in part, maybe it's been answered in a different way, maybe a different method, different methodology. So based on that literature search, you may want to make changes to your question. And then you need to decide on who are going to be best suited to answer my question. What methodology am I going to use? Can you think of any possible ethical implications? That's important to think about, because what you then need to do is write your project outline. If you're going to do interviews, then you need to write out your interview questions. Make your consent form, make your debrief, and then before the end of August, submit all that to the School of Psychology Ethics Committee. Obviously, we will be going backwards and forwards a lot before that, before we actually submit that, the final documents. And I can submit that for you if you like as well. But it's important to have that done before the end of August, because you need to spend September and October actually collecting data. You need to keep the rest of the time for thinking about it, thinking about your data. So during September and October, data collection, what that may mean: if you do interviews, you need to do those and record them, or if it's focus groups, do them and record them, or if you want to maybe do discourse analysis or diary study method, you need to have chosen your written material that you're going to analyze, and then analyze it. So in November, so the time after you've collected data before Christmas, you need to have transcribed your data. That means this only applies if you've done interviews or focus groups. So it just means sitting for days on end with headphones on, typing as if your life depends on it. And you need to type it out verbatim, so exactly what they said, including if they say, I'm like, I'm like, and I was like, you actually need to put the word like in exactly where they say it, which can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. You need to make it anonymous, so you need to give interviews a number. If they mention any names of people that you might know, you need to change those into something that is not identifiable. And then you need to send your transcript to a second coder. More on that in a minute. You can see I'm really spelling out what you should do with your Christmas break. During the Christmas break, ideally, you need to start the coding process. What code can you find in the transcripts? That's the first part of the interpretation. Coding, it may sound like a bit like a mythical concept, a bit mysterious, but all it is you read a passage of text and you give a higher order label to that. So in this passage there are two codes you can see. My parents never told me you have to go to university, you have to study. Giving a label to that means you turn it into psychological terms. So what they're doing here, they're talking about own responsibility. Or I'm really interested in these particular subjects I'm studying. What that means is intrinsic motivation. So you go through the whole text putting little labels in the margins. And obviously you'll use the same, if it's the same thing that other people are saying, you use the same label for that. Also start thinking about how are these codes linked together. In other words, what are the overarching themes? If you do grounded theory, think about how these themes might go together to form an explanatory framework. Also, you need to do this for the transcripts that you've been asked to second code. So you need to send them to each other. So the second coder, that would be one of you. Each of you is paired with another person in the group to provide an extra pair of eyes on your data. It's not so that you have to agree on codes and themes. It's not like inter-rater reliability. It's got nothing to do with that, because there's no single right way to code your data. But what it does is, if somebody else looks at your data and they give you their interpretation, it helps you to see how your own bias, your own interpretation frame, your own colored glasses, how they influenced your coding. So just as an example, this is from the book. This is what one of the authors was saying. Some years ago, a young man in my undergraduate seminar conducted research on adaptation to disability. He had become paraplegic himself when he was hit by a car while cycling. His 10 in-depth interviews were filled with stories of courage, innovation and hope. That was not what the student themselves was seeing into it. The student talked about grief, anger and loss. When I noted that his analysis did not reflect his collected material, he realized how his feelings, his own feelings about disability, colored his perceptions of other people's disabilities. So that enabled the student to go back to the interviews and actually see them. in a different light. So, moving on to next year, it's 2019, that's the time to write your introduction. So what is known about this topic? And that can be quite short. Then you need to write your method section. So how did you go about actually conducting your study? What's your methodology and your ontology and your epistemology? And then send all that to me for feedback, including your results. And your results section will be the identified themes with the description and the quotes. I can read that and give you feedback on it. I can't read your discussion. We can only have a chat about that. But we can chat about that as much as you like, even though we can't look at what you've written. So in your discussion you have to talk about how do your findings relate to the literature. What have you discovered that's new about this topic? So, just in case other students ask, you're doing qualitative psychology, what's that? How is it different from what I'm doing? Well, you can tell them that it's you're doing it the inductive way instead of deductive. So you don't start with a theory and then work down to test it and see if you can find support for your hypothesis. You start with people's experience and you explore whatever might come up from that. So you're open to finding out things beyond what you might have looked at if you had done it the quantitative way. Your introduction in the thesis will be much shorter than everybody else. But on the other hand, you'll have a massive result section because your data are words instead of numbers. No numbers means no SPSS, which may be joy to some of you. Your sample will be really small. Most people will try to find as many people as possible. You're trying to find a purposive sample, so people who can tell you something about the question that you're interested in. We're not trying to generalize. Also, this coding process needs to go in your appendix, and the second coding process as well. So all the stages that you went through, maybe notes that you made from when you met with your second coder, all of that needs to go in appendix. So I'm hoping that you will find this as interesting as I find it. So I will see you on, I think we said Tuesday, but it's on my calendar, so I'm sure we'll I'll be here when you're here. So we'll have a chat about this. Any questions that you have about this video, please do write them down and bring them along. So I'll see you then.